Trust in politics is broken. So can we get UK politics working again?
That was the last time we were happy. 2012.
I'm Beth Rigby, Sky's political editor. Join me every week with Labour's Jess Phillips and Conservative peer Ruth Davidson for some electoral dysfunction.
This idea of nuance has completely left politics.
Yeah. Together, we'll focus on the policies that could deliver political satisfaction. Follow Electoral Dysfunction wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, where there is so much news around. We're actually going to be covering two political stories. Later, we'll be taking a look at the Scottish Government rolling back on its, admittedly ambitious emissions targets, having missed 8 out of the last 12 milestones. Thomas Moore, our science correspondent, will be here for that. But before we head to Holyrood, we start in Westminster, where, stop me if you've heard this before, a Conservative MP has had the whip removed, essentially been suspended from the party over allegations of sleaze. Heaven forfend, who'd have thunk it, so on and so forth. One man absolutely free from scandal who regularly bathes in the disinfectant that is sunlight. Our political correspondent, Darren McCaffrey, joins us on the podcast. Darren, what on earth is going on and who is it involving?
I don't think there are many people, Neil, who've ever heard of Mark Menzies. He's not exactly a front-page MP, but he is on the front pages today because once having been a rising star of the Conservative Party, an MP in Lancashire since 2010, he was actually one of David Cameron's A-listers. He is yet again marred in scandal. He's been suspended by the Conservative Party. He's had his government job removed. He was a trade envoy, and he's facing an investigation by the Conservative Party and possibly, this is what Labour are calling for today, a police investigation too.
We will, of course, say at this point that Mr Menzies denies the allegations. But what are they?
Yeah, he really strongly disputes them, but they are frankly quite bizarre. This all dates back to December when apparently he called up his former campaign manager, who's 78 years old, at 3:15 a.m. in the morning, so essentially in the middle of the night. She gets woken up by a phone call where he is pleading with her to hand over £5,000 because he's been held effectively in a locked flat by what he calls some bad people and suggests that this is life or death. She essentially says, I can't do this, it's the middle of the night, unsurprisingly. He then, the next morning, is contacted by his actual campaign manager, who the 78-year-old has got in touch with overnight, and she dips into her savings, into her ISA to find this money. Wow. But by that time, the amount of money demanded has gone up to 6,500 quid. So she hands this over, apparently. And then it takes an even stranger twist that he finally gets out of this locked flat and another member of staff comes to essentially take him away. And at that point, he has to hand over more money, this staff, for hundreds of pounds, because he owes money to 2 other men. That's apparently, according to the Times newspaper, that's where he ended up. And the reason this is interesting is that he's got form apparently for this, if you believe what the Times have written today. Just the very next day, he was asking for £35,000 to help pay for some medical expenses. And this is where it gets politically very difficult for him, is because there are suggestions that he essentially was dipping into campaign funds, money that was raised for him to try and get re-elected in order to pay off these, frankly, very personal expenses.
So wait a second. Not only, and these remain allegations, but the allegations as stated are this: not only that he was being held by, in inverted commas, bad men, not only that he was asking for money to pay them off, not only that there was multiple payoffs at that point, not only that he was asking for assistance with medical expenses, but that the money allegedly came from campaign budgets.
That clearly is the bit where it does get very, very, very tricky for him. It's really interesting, this, Neil, because we don't really know enough detail, and we're actually the law itself when it comes to campaign financing and also the potential intention of donors. Now, there are suggestions that actually having a fit MP, even if that means involving paying for private medical expenses, could be seen as legitimate kind of campaign funding, in the sense that you need your MP to be up and about and be able to campaign.
Stretch. That's a stretch at best.
Neil, I will always stretch to find... I mean, this is a story that stretches into many different corners, so I'm going to go into a corner in which there could be a line of defence there. Again, that will be up for others to decide.
We may well break the Sky News daily record for the number of times I say the MP denies the allegations in this particular section. But let me just read Mark Menzies' statement. I strongly dispute the allegations put to me. I have fully complied with all the rules for declarations. As there is an investigation ongoing, I will not be commenting further. The thing that puzzles me, Darren, as you say, this was reported to the Conservative Party in December. Why was nothing done about it then? It really looks like an article came out in a newspaper and the government has had to do something about it. That's how it looks.
Well, that is the bottom line. But the Conservative Party would say they did launch an investigation. There has been an investigation into this since January. I think that leads to two questions, or maybe three actually. A, why have we not known about this? And why, if the investigation was launched then, what materially has changed enough for him to have the whip suspended yesterday, apart from the publication of this story? Second of all, as Labour are saying today, frankly, why not call in the police? Because there could be criminal activity in all of this. And third of all, just the length of time. I mean, how long was this going to go on for? Is 3 months not enough to get to the bottom of what might well have happened here? It's become really interesting how the police are now just almost having to make these kind of political decisions, if you like, whether it's Partygate with Boris, Beergate with Keir, whether it's Angela Rayner, whether it's this. It now seems that politicians essentially are turning to police forces across the country to try and settle these issues.
You mentioned right at the very beginning of our conversation, Darren, that Mark Menzies, this was a rising star of the 2010 intake. David Cameron, saw potential in him. He was a minister, and he had to step back from that post, didn't he?
He had to resign, effectively, as a member of David Cameron's government. He was on the lowest rung of the ladder, parliamentary private secretary, but still, in 2014, over allegations of paying for sex and of taking illicit drugs.
The MP denied those allegations at the time.
He denied them. He said they were malicious. The police did look into it and didn't take any further action. Then 3 years later, he was questioned by the police again under allegations that he had got an acquaintance's dog drunk deliberately.
The MP denied getting the dog drunk.
The police didn't take any further action, but I think his parliamentary career has been somewhat blighted, I would say, by allegations. Allegations, again, we will reiterate that he is constantly denied, and the police have never felt the need to take any further action on.
The Conservative Party whip operation at the moment, I think, is in real dire straits. Let me just run you through some of the allegations that have led to Conservative MPs having the whip suspended. Improper lobbying, appearing on I'm a Celebrity, groping two men whilst drunk, tractor porn, comparing the COVID vaccine to the Holocaust, making inappropriate advances to staff, sexual harassment against 3 women, bullying an employee, indecently exposing themselves to that employee, and the sexual assault of a 15-year-old boy. Now, we can laugh about the tractor porn and all the rest of it, but this is a party right now with significant problems, both with the discipline that their MPs, or lack thereof, that they are showing, but also the way in which the party polices them.
I would actually say, though, that this is a bigger problem for Parliament. There are Labour names there with actually, in some ways, quite similar allegations. There is one Plaid Cymru MP. I think there's 2 SNP MPs. Geoffrey Donaldson, for example, is one of the latest MPs to have had his name removed from his party. He's someone who's facing a rape allegation. It is more difficult for the Conservative Party because they're in such political peril at the moment. You look at the opinion polls, the last thing Rishi Sunak can afford is just another scandal. It just eats into everything else. And that's why it's so bad for the government at the moment. But Parliament does fundamentally, definitely have a big problem. And it's a problem that no one thus far has been managed to be able to grapple with.
But doesn't this just take you back to 1997? I understand you are somewhat younger than me, Mr. McCaffrey. But at the same time, doesn't this remind you of that period when the Conservatives were very clearly on their way out? The Labour Party was riding high in the polls. There was an expectation there would be a landslide at the next election, and it was sleaze story after sleaze story after sleaze story.
I mean, the parallels are just endless. I mean, they really, really are. Blair got a massive majority, 179. He won that majority because, people, of course, switched from the Conservative Party to Labour. But more fundamentally, it's because a lot of Conservative voters just stayed at home. John Major got more votes on absolute numbers than Tony Blair did in 97, because a lot of people turned out in 92 to vote. And I think the concern for the Conservative Party this time is they keep banging on about how Keir Starmer is not popular with the public. And there's an opinion poll out today suggesting that they've got a point on that. Their concern, I think, has to be, is not that everyone's sweeping towards Labour and Keir's incredibly popular, is that their own voters, their traditional voters, simply, whenever the election is later on this year, just won't bother to vote because of scandals like this.
Indeed. Darren, thanks very much. Stay where you are. Up next, Scottish politics and the SNP commitment to net zero. Welcome back. We turn now to climate change and the governmental response to it, or lack thereof. The Scottish Government is rolling back in its commitment to cutting emissions by 2030, as countries around the world, frankly, take long, hard looks at the promises they've made and announce that they can't keep them. Our science correspondent, Thomas Moore, joins us on the podcast. Let's start with what the Scottish Government's position was previously. People bandy around this word ambitious an awful lot when it comes to climate change, but in truth, it really was an ambitious target.
Scotland led the UK nations in its ambition. They wanted to cut greenhouse gases by 75% by 2030. And that was a milestone that was going to take it towards that net zero challenge of 2050. And it's really important because the science is clear that it's no good leaving everything to the last minute and then suddenly trying to eliminate carbon from your economy. It is these early days which are really important in reducing the overload amount of carbon in the atmosphere. But they are now backpedaling, and I think it's reality dawns. And I think that is the challenge that is facing all governments.
I think people in Scotland have been aware that there has been a problem with the Scottish Government and its targets for quite some time. But this really kind of came into broader public consciousness, I suppose, with that report from the Climate Change Committee flagging all of this up. First and foremost, we should say what the Climate Change Committee is, because you tend to think of, whenever we mention committees on this podcast, of them being a select committee, a committee of the Scottish Parliament.
They are an independent panel of experts that advise both the UK government and the Scottish government on, first of all, whether they are on track with their climate objectives, and also what they should be aiming for. And they very much reflect the consensus of scientists around the world that we do need to ramp up our ambition, that the costs of doing nothing will be far greater than the costs of reaching out for net zero. Why
has Scotland found itself in this embarrassing and invidious position, having missed, 8 out of the 12 milestones that they were supposed to be hitting? I mean, Scotland, it's not a desperately industrialised nation.
No, but it does have a big finger in the pie of the oil economy, doesn't it, in Aberdeen? And I think that is part of the problem. That there were a lot of jobs at stake here, and a fair transition has been the ambition for all governments. Just look what happened with the coal industry in England, which was eviscerated by the Tory government back in the 1980s and 90s. And there were an awful lot of people, whole communities that really crashed until the likes of Nissan and call centres came in to really replace those jobs. And there is an anxiety for any politician that there has to be some way for people to earn money if suddenly those old fossil fuel jobs go. When these ambitious targets were set back in 2019 or so, the world economy was ticking on nicely. And then suddenly COVID came along. The cost of lockdown, then, of course, the Ukraine-Russia war sent inflation through the roof. People are really struggling to pay household bills. And I think politicians are nervous that come election time, people will be thinking about how hard up they are, whether they're any better off now than they were at the last election. And for many people, the answer is no. And why should they pay for this green transition?
The Climate Change Committee's outgoing Chief Executive, Chris Stark, had said this is the first time anywhere in the United Kingdom that they have said that a target cannot be met. None of which is to say, of course, that the Scottish Government is not going to still maintain some of its targets. I mean, I'm told I think it's going to be dropped from 75 to 65% emissions by 2030.
They have expressed concerns about the current pace of transition in England too, or in UK as a whole. The committee is very anxious that government should stay on track with its carbon objectives. And the economic realities now, politicians are beginning to look at these targets in a new light and judging whether it's better to dump them now rather than fail later.
On the one hand, you look at organisations like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and the massive public support that they do seem to get for their direct action. And then you compare and contrast with, OK, you mentioned the Conservative parties. Rewind, it wasn't that long ago that David Cameron was hugging a husky. Fast forward, and you've got Rishi Sunak backing away from net zero commitments.
Well, remember, David Cameron too also backed away from hugging huskies and dumped what he called the green crap from energy bills. I think ultimately politicians recognise overwhelming scientific consensus that we do need to cut carbon from our economies. A cleaner world is the only way we're going to be able to stabilise the increasingly wild weather that we see. Just look at Dubai, a desert nation which is now awash with floods. Absolutely extraordinary. Our own sodden spring, the warm 2023 and even likely warmer 2024. You can't ignore the fingerprints of climate change around the world. The difficulty is how you negotiate these really difficult political minefields that are there for governments in convincing people that it's worth paying upfront, paying more on their household bills, just to make sure that we have the technology that is going to be able to have a carbon-free economy.
Is that then just a question of, the politicians bottling it, not having the balls to have an adult, mature conversation with the electorate on this topic? I mean, we've focused, of course, on the Conservatives and the SNP because they're in government in Westminster and Holyrood, but the likely next government, Labour, I mean, let's not forget, they abandoned their £28 billion a year green investment commitment as well.
This isn't necessarily party political. You have right and left struggling with these commitments in the current economic climate. Western democracies have very short election cycles. It's easy for the Chinese, for example, that 20 years ago saw the changing economic picture, bought up mines in Africa, basically own from beginning to end the whole production of electronic vehicles and therefore can set a rock bottom price. They saw the horizons, they made a dash for them. The Western governments, which are 4 or 5 year election cycles, can't do that.
If we can't all switch to a rather more long-term parliamentary cycle, what needs to be done? I thought this is why we had meetings like COP.
There is this overwhelming consensus, as I say, that you not only need to set tough ambitions for reducing carbon by 2030, and according to the UN panel of experts, they need to reduce it by 43% from 2019 levels by 2013. That's an important milestone towards 2050. But then you need to hit that target of 2050 and net zero itself. Otherwise, there's just no way you're going to get to 1.5 degrees. And that is seen as a threshold beyond which the climate kind of descends into increasing chaos. Even now, the weather is becoming more extreme. Records are being shattered all the time. If you look at the cost of adaptation, insurance, the damage caused by all the floods, the droughts, the heat waves, both to the economy and, of course, to health too, and people's lives. That is really challenging, but it's costs way down the line. And that's why politicians think it's easier now in terms of selling this idea to the public if they have a vague goal still of reaching net zero by 2050, while at the same time recognising that people are finding it tough with household bills now.
Do you despair of our politicians when it comes to this, Thomas?
I'd look at the evidence, not just on paper and all the reports that come across my desk, but look out the window. I haven't seen snow in a long time in my back garden. And yet my kids, who are now grown up, left home, there were times when we would go sledging. And this is something that kids in the UK just aren't going to be growing up with anymore. And farmers too, this spring, can't plant crops because the fields are so wet, the wettest they've ever seen in their lifetimes. So the climate is changing all around us, and we can either recognise that and do something about it up front by trying to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, or we pay later. And recognise that food security isn't what it was. All these things will add up. It is cost.
Thomas, many thanks.
Cheers.
Of course, the Scottish Government is clearly not alone in backtracking on its green commitments, of taking a step back, perhaps mindful, perhaps fearful of an electoral backlash from voters. The Conservatives in Westminster have done exactly the same. And it's no coincidence that both have been watching their polling numbers through their fingers. In fact, the Conservatives have seen theirs go through the floor in a way the SNPs have not, of course, which does make you wonder why the Tories responded by sitting on allegations that would make a banker blush for 4 months before removing the whip from Mark Menzies. A broken commitment to emissions in Edinburgh, in Westminster. Who remembers Rishi Sunak's Downing Street pledge of integrity? Political promises do have a shelf life, yes, but so too do governments. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.